My name's Gary Tubb. I'm the faculty director here, and we're really delighted to have a poetry reading here in this center, and especially to have one involving one of our own professors, Srikanth Reddy, and his together with his colleague Jeet Thayil. And I'm also very happy that we have with us from Shiv Nadar University, another faculty member from their Department of English, Dr. Akhil Katyal. We've been waiting so long to have this poetry reading, and I'm so happy to have all three of these people here that rather than take up any more of your time, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Katyal, who will introduce our two poets, and then once they've done their reading, he will also moderate a question and answer session. And then I'll appear briefly at the end of all of that. So here is Dr. Akhil Katyal.
Thanks a lot, Gary. This promises to be a really lovely evening of poetry. We are very glad to have Srikanth Reddy and Jeet Thayil, who would be reading for us in that order. I've been given the lovely task of introducing Jeet and Srikanth. Some bits you might already know, some bits you might discover. In alphabetical order, Srikanth Reddy has written 2 books of poetry, Facts for Visitors and Voyager, and a critical study, Changing Subjects, Digressions in Modern American Poetry. He's a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Chicago, and his many awards include fellowships from the Whiting Foundation, the Wisconsin Institute of Creative Writing, and the Mellon Foundation. His poetry has been widely anthologized, including in Asian American Poetry, The Next Generation, and 100 Love Poems by Younger American Poets. He works closely with the university's program in Poetry and Poetics, which is an interdisciplinary collective of scholars, poets, and translators who work on poetry. Reddy's poetry, as it will become very evident to us this evening, cuts details into thinner and thinner slices till you see the world laid out in cross-sections. In his poem Corruption, for instance, he writes, "One curious property of cuttlefish is that, once dead, its body begins to glow. The mild phosphorescence reaches its greatest intensity a few days after death, then ebbs away as the body decays. You can read by this light." When imagine that, reading by the light of a dead cuttlefish. We'd be very happy to have Srikanth Reddy reading for us. I'll quickly introduce Jeet, who will be going next in the order. Jeet Thayil was born in Kerala and was educated in Bombay, Hong Kong, and New York. His 4 poetry collections include English, and These Errors Are Correct, which won the Sahitya Akademi Award for Poetry last year. Jeet has edited the Bloodaxe book of contemporary Indian poets and is a visiting professor of poetry at the University of Goa. Also a musician and a songwriter, he's one half of the contemporary music project Sridhar Thayil. His novel Narcopolis won the 2012 DSC Prize for South Asian Literature and was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, the Man Asian Literature Prize, and the Commonwealth Prize. Thayil's poetry, as many of you know, is both razor sharp and unafraid of feeling. He's someone who can write of the New Year night in Goa. The midnight cataracts whiten, and hears the sea hissing its one stuttered consonant. But he's also a poet, for instance, who, in his poem to Baudelaire, which at a recent festival in Paris he was constantly compared to Baudelaire can write, "I don't miss you. I don't miss you when I open a window and light fills the room like water pouring into a paper cup." We will also have the pleasure of hearing him read from his work. So, Srikanth, it would be lovely to start.
Is that okay? Can you hear me? Are we reading? We're reading here? Is this coming across? Yeah? Okay. Thanks for coming. Happy Thanksgiving if you're traveled from the US to hear me read tonight. Thank you, Jeet, for being here, and Gary, and Aditi, and Bharat, and everyone at the center. It's really great to be here. I'm going to read just the beginning of a book that I'm working on now, and it's very much in a rough state, but I thought, why not? I don't know if there's anything you need to know, really. This is a gesture that means I'm quoting something else. It's probably an obscene gesture as well. So it's a book about kind of rough year. And I think it'll become clear as I read why that's the case. There's kind of a bad translation in it as well, but you'll pick up on that too. The poem is called Readings in World Literature. You can hear me fine, right? Okay. 1. In the inky, dismal, and unprofitable research of a recent leave of absence from the middle of my life, I came across an inscription on a historical prism of Ashurbanipal that I found to be somewhat disquieting. Of an enemy whose remains he had abused in a manner that does not bear repeating here, this most studious and exacting of Mesopotamian kings professes, I made him more dead than he was before. Prisms of this sort were often buried in the foundations of government buildings, and therefore intended to be read by gods, but not men. Somewhere in the maze of carols and stacks, I thought I could hear a low dial tone humming without end. In Ashurbanipal's library, there's a poem written on clay that corrects various commonly held errors regarding the world of the dead. Contrary to the accounts of Moulian, Madame Blavatsky, Quasi-Benefo, et al., it is not customarily permitted to visit the underworld. No, the underworld visits you. 2. The underworld visits you in a dream in the poem in the Dead King's Library. Pulling the door to the dream closed behind you, the inside bolt feels thick with dust. You pass a heap of discarded crowns. The inmates, their mouths stained with clay, are suited in feathers. At the end of the corridor, you arrive at a registration desk. There was the queen of the underworld, the goddess Ereshkigal. Before her crouched Mamalasserie, the clerk of the underworld, holding a tablet, reading aloud in her presence. She raised her head. She saw me. Who was it fetched this man here? Who was it brought this fellow here? Cuneiform tablets describing the Mesopotamian house of dust refer to a clerk who must enter the names of those scheduled to die each day. Her own name, however, is irretrievably defaced in the poem from the Dead King's Library, Mamalasserie. Little is known about this indefatigable scribe. First, she has only one inexhaustible theme. Second, she writes for an ideal reader, the lady of the dead, who perpetually tears at her hair with fingers like pickaxes. Third, she works in a timeless form, which allows for considerable prosodic variation en route to a fixed conclusion. I'll skip a section here and there. 4. Already it's beginning to seem that I cannot avoid the subject of this nation's interminable abuse of another's remains. But I'd have preferred to write something along the lines of a poetic essay on comparative underworlds. For the past few years, I've taught a course titled Readings in World Literature, which has frequently proven to be a disappointment, both to myself and to the students, some in headscarves, some occasionally dressed in fatigues, who have registered for this seminar in order to satisfy their humanities requirement. It confirmed my hatred of epics and reaffirmed my faith that I will never study medieval literature. The instructor is fairly intelligent and enthusiastic about his brand of writing, but is unreceptive, even intolerant, of anything that is not a poem or a poem in prose form. These are real, you can laugh. Made me question things, including the value of higher education. It can so easily become detached from real life. It occurred to me that by writing about teaching, I might learn something. There would be assignments, a midterm, and a final examination, followed by a series of detonations and the inward collapse of an abandoned complex under stars. I needed to find my footing in the order of things. And because I know almost nothing about the world, I decided to work my way up from below. 5. Hume 101, Introduction to the Underworld, cross-listed with Comp Lit. In this course, students will be ferried across the river of sorrow, subsist on a diet of clay, weigh their hearts against a feather on the infernal balance, and ascend a viewing pagoda in order to gaze upon their homelands until emptied of all emotion. Texts will include the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Mayan Book of the Dead, the Ethiopian Book of the Dead, and Muriel Rukeyser's Book of the Dead. The goals of the course are to introduce students to the posthumous disciplinary regimes of various cultures, and to help them develop the communication skills that are crucial for success in today's global marketplace. All readings in English. Requirements include the death of the student, an oral lamentation, and a final paper. 6. I promised my wife that I would call Dr. Song today. After putting the baby down for her nap and slipping outside for a smoke, I lifted the receiver. The sound it emitted, which I've heard without pause countless times before, seemed to me otherworldly now, like somebody's finger playing upon the wet rim of a crystal bowl in a derelict theater from before the wars. I can't say how long I stood there listening. It may have been seconds or seasons. The rings of Saturn kept turning in their groove. For reasons beyond me, my unit on Dante wasn't scheduled until the following quarter. I dialed 1-800-INFERNO, and before the first ring, a woman answered in heavily accented English. "Is it you?" "I think so," I replied. Outside my window, the honey locusts sprinkled their pale spinning leaves. Focusing on one as it fell seemed to slow the collective descent. O creature, gracious and good, traversing the dusky element to visit us, who stained the world with blood, the woman recited, as if reading, against her will, from a prepared text. I could hear rain trickling in a gutter spout on the other end of the line. "Please, remove my name from your list," I said, and return the receiver to its cradle. 7. Unborn child of Ragda al-Wafi, Ragda al-Wafi, Saad Adwar, uncle of Emmanuel Karim, Uday, father of Adam Easue, Adam Easue. Now and then I find myself scrolling through the day's dead online. I never get far in these lists. I suppose I'm too easily distracted. Sometimes the entries ramify and fracture, like leafy twigs shaken from a tree. Unborn child of Bassam, wife of Bassam, father-in-law of Bassam, Bassam, cousin of Maha al-Khoury, uncle of Maha al-Khoury, But where was Maha al-Khoury herself that day? Maybe she'd stepped out to purchase vegetables for the evening meal. Spinach, chickpeas, okra, and eggplant. It would explain her absence from the list. Sometimes the prosody settles into anapasts. Adnan Attallah, grandson of Mona Abdullah Haddad. Sometimes the names remain forever in question. Saad? Nabil? They pose a typographical problem. George? Fadi? Rita? John? You don't want to sound like you're expecting an answer. 8. While outlining the requirements for our first critical essay of the season, I notice a hand rising tentatively in the classroom's farthest corner. What if I'm ideologically opposed to revision? Asks the red-headed boy in a New Slaves t-shirt. A city bus unloads its pageantry just outside the window. A handful of sparrows erupts from the equestrian statue on the quad. I remember Sun Tzu's advice to humanities instructors, which I review on index cards on the eve of each new term. Hold out baits to entice the enemy, feign disorder, and crush him. What exactly is your ideology? I ask, tactically stroking my beard. I'm a Zen Nax-like crypto-objectivist, replied my interlocutor. How about you? Removing the bran flake that I've discovered in my beard, I have no choice but to improvise. Pro-recycling? Anti-genocide? A voice from beyond my peripheral vision says, "You're nothing but a pseudo-Kantian neoliberal mirage with meta-narcissistic tendencies." No, I'm not. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. 9. A window onto the purgatorial cosmology of late imperial China may be found on page 26 of Léon Uyghur's Folklore chinoise moderne, Xianxian, Imprimerie de la Mission Catholique, 1909. Contemporary Anglophone readers, however, must do without an English version of Father Uyghur's folklore. I'll have no more translations into English, writes this unsung Jesuit sinologist in a letter to his superiors, dated 3 February 1929. English is the Protestant's tongue, and I want nothing to do with those devils. Thus, the strange tale of Chen from Hu Chu Fu remains largely unknown in this land. But if you'll pardon my French, which is damnable, I confess, I thought I might work up a rough transcript for purposes of instruction. Draft only. Please, do not circulate. 10. In the district of Hu Chu Fu, the magistrate's assistant Chen was taking a nap in his study. Suddenly, a motorized airport staircase appeared and beckoned him to follow. It led Chen down a path hidden by rustling thickets of bamboo to a clearing where, on a high pedestal, an enormous mirror waited in the moonlight. "Regard what you once were in your previous life," said the motorized airport staircase. Looking into the mirror, Chen saw a man in a tasseled cap and scarlet shoes, dressed like a scholar from the recent past. "Now see what you were in the life before that one." Rubbing his eyes, Chen looked again and saw a high official in old Ming costume. Black cap, red dragonfly robe, belt with jade buckle, black boots. Just then, a servant rushed into the clearing. prostrated himself before Chen and exclaimed, "Don't you recognize me? I was your servant in Ta Tung Fu." But of course, that was over 200 years ago. With that said, he handed Chen a scroll. "What's this?" Chen asked dreamily. "See for yourself," the servant replied. Skipping a little Chen. 12. Our nanny called in sick today, and I stayed home with the baby, watching a tree squirrel tuck twigs and trash into a wreck of a nest outside the kitchen window, instead of continuing with my translation. "I love eyebrows," announced Mira, crumpling her bib. "I love napkin. I love upstairs." On the radio, a woman with a Northern Irish accent described efforts to restore various archaeological sites in and around the provincial capital of Al-Hila, where the ancient Mesopotamian city of Babylon once stood. Speaking through an interpreter, a government official described how the 2,600-year-old paving stones of the ancient city's processional way had been crushed under the treads of M1 Abrams tanks. A heliport had been constructed in the ruins. The remains of a ziggurat, which some scholars believe may be the original site of the Tower of Babel, however, appeared to be largely intact for the time being. "I love flowers. I love fire," Mira continued. "I love foreheads, too." At some point in the day, Dr. Song left me a message. Later that evening, I looked in the bathroom mirror to see if I could detect any trace of infractions from a previous life. All I could make out was the chipped and tarnished surface of the mirror, flickering, almost imperceptibly. I looked again. This time, to my relief, I saw a man dressed like a scholar from the recent past. Vintage cardigan, thinning hair, an untenured affect of worry beyond repair. I love forks. I love flags. I love shoelaces, too. 13. Upon hearing his tale, affairs from long ago began to infiltrate Chen's memory, although in a disordered and cloudy fashion. He thanked his old retainer. A passing dragonfly landed on his sleeve. "Would you prefer to travel on foot or by some other means?" inquired the motorized airport staircase. "Who ever heard of a high functionary trudging about on foot?" protested the cadaverous valet, already beginning to fade around the edges. Ascending the scuffed metal steps, Chen bid his servant farewell. After a journey of many leagues, he came to a red river moving slowly through jungle. Two boys swam against the current, their heads dipping in and out of view. From his perch atop the staircase, Chen noted how their blowguns helped them to stay afloat. He could see clouds of butterflies suspended above the leafy canopy on the far shore. Up to this point in his travels, Chen had marveled at his expeditious conveyance, which traversed mountains and deserts alike without any action on his part. But now he protested in vain as the infernal contraption sped into the river's shallows. Chen waved to the boys midstream, calling for assistance. Out of earshot, they playfully waved back. The staircase pushed on through the deepening flow. As the waters rose around him, Chen's soaked robes grew impossibly heavy, dragging the former assistant magistrate down into the crimson flux. The last thing he remembered was his mouth filling with blood, which he sensed, somehow, was not his own. "14. Let's read a few more sections. Please print clearly and remember your name. 1. The river of fire in ancient Greek thanatopography feeds into the river of blank. 2. From the river of pain spring two rivers, the river of blank and the river of blank. 3. The river of blank runs a separate course entirely, concealed inside a dead word for truth. 4. At the sight of sinners approaching, the blank seethes like butter in a frying pan. 5. Blank is the Sanskrit river of ash. 6. As the sun god Ra floats down the river of the hidden chamber, his head is exchanged for that of a blank. 7. Those for whom much lamentation is made find the blank swollen with tears and difficult to cross. 8. To our knowledge, the river of blank has no name. 15. Melanoma, from the ancient Greek verb melaino, to blacken, combined with the nominalizing suffix ma, which indicates process or action. Hence, pragma, action or occurrence, from prato, to do, or poema, poem, from poieo, to make. These days, it seems obligatory for survivors' narratives to muse upon the etymologies of their various illnesses and medical treatments. It lends grandeur to the experience of leafing through Red Book in an empty examination room while dressed in a paper gown that won't draw closed around the back. But I can't refrain from wondering at how a description, black, becomes an action, to blacken, which in turn becomes a thing, melanoma, a darkening. There's a whole grammar and metaphysics to this black traffic. The root may be traced to the Sanskrit mala, dirt or filth, and flowers into our modern English melancholy. 16. The odds are good, Dr. Song tells me in his office. Still, he blinks too much as he answers my wife's questions about this perplexing case. Melanoma is exceedingly rare among individuals of my dusky extraction, and virtually non-existent among younger members of this population. "You're a medical miracle," joked one nurse before I went under, but not the good kind. At least my tests show no spread to the neighboring lymph nodes, lowering the mortality rate within 3 years to roughly 1 in 10. Not bad odds. I resolve not to make too much of this matter in the days to come. But the complimentary brochure that I take from the rack as I exit the reception area says I mustn't make too little of it either. In this respect, my condition is not unlike the war. I don't want to make too much of it in my ambient transactional order, but I don't want to make too little of it either. 17. Outside, the first snow of the academic year descends so softly, it seems to fall upward. Mamalasserie recites the names of dead Americans into her bullhorn across the quad. Whether in protest or veneration, I can't say. Stray bangs fall out from under her fuchsia toque in real time. I look over my attendance sheet as the last stragglers arrive. Rebecca Alderete Baca, Sean Heng Devan, Se Hao Guang. Note that I've changed the identities of individuals to protect the names of the innocent. It helps to compare things, I begin unsteadily, to see where you stand in the world. I haven't been feeling like myself lately. A passing dragonfly lands on my sleeve. Anyone who studies the domain of likeness is a comparatist, I continue, already beginning to fade around the edges. Simile is the buried suture that holds reality together, I say, trying not to lose my place. Sorry, I've lost my place. Simile is like a buried suture that holds reality together. I turn to the blackboard, but can't for the life of me remember what I'd intended to write there. Chalky swirls from the previous instructor's hasty erasure make a dense fog of its surface. The faded equations still legible underneath, like a selfie of the cooling universe, or a hydrothermal vent on the bottom of the sea. I stand at that black entrance. How long, I can't say. Maybe I'm still there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Real pleasure to be here and to read with Srikanth. First time I read you was Facts for Visitors, and I remember loving the book and putting it in and contacting you then for the anthology I was working on. So it's a real pleasure to be reading with Srikanth here today. Pleasure to be here at the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. My thanks to Srikanth, to Gary, to Aditi, and to Akhil for agreeing to introduce us. I'm going to read a small group of poems from These Errors Are Correct, which was my last book of poems in 2008, and very likely my last book of poems ever. Small group of poems. The book appeared in 2004, and I wrote the poems in the early years of the 21st century and tried to imagine what this century would be like. And of course, all I could think about at the time was the war that appeared to be shaping up. And I think the decade that's passed since then has only confirmed what these poems hinted at. The first is called Spiritus Mundi. It's a kind of a fictional autobiography. I was born in the Christian south of a subcontinent mad for religion. Warriors and zealots tried to rule it. A minor disciple carried his doubt like a torch to temple and shrine. I longed for vision and couldn't tell it. The cities I grew up in were landlocked. One, a capital, buff with architecture, the other lost for months in monsoon. One was old, one poor, both were hot. The heat vaporized thought and order, drained the will, obliterated reason. I settled, 20 and morose, in a town built by a patricidal emperor whose fratricidal son imprisoned him for 8 years with a view of the tomb he built for his wife, to remember her. I was overconscious of my rhyme, and of the houses, 3 inside my head. In the streets, death in saffron or green rode a cycle rickshaw slung with megaphones. On the kitchen step, a chili plant grew dusty in the wind. In that climate, nothing survived the sun or a pickaxe. Not even a stone dome that withstood 400 years of voices raised in prayer or argument. The train pulled in each day at an empty platform where a tea stall that served passers-by became a famous fire shrine. I made a change. I traveled west, in time to see a century end and begin. I don't recall the summer of 2001. Did it exist? There would have been sun and rain. I was there, I don't remember. A time before autumn of that year. Now 45, my hair gone sparse, I'm a poet of small buildings. The brownstone, the townhouse, the cold water walk-up, the tenement of 2 or 3 floors. I cherish the short ones still standing. I recognize each cornice and sill, the sky's familiar cast, the window I spend my day walking to and from, as if I were a baffled Mughal in his cell. I call the days by their Hindu names and myself by my Christian one. The Atlantic's stately breakers mine the shore for kelp, mussels, bits of glass. They move in measured iambs, tidy as the towns that rise from sign to neon sign. Night rubs its feet. A mouse deer starts across the grass. The sky drains to a distant eddy. Badshah, I say, to no one there. I hear a koel in the call of a barn owl. All things combine and recombine. The sky streams in ribbons of color. I'm my father and my son grown old. Everything that lives, lives on. I feel like I'm back in my MFA program, except I'm on the other side of the podium. This is Letter from a Mughal Emperor, 2006. He's not named in the poem, but this is the first Mughal emperor who set up the empire in India. He was a poet, and some of these lines have been stolen word for word from the Baburnama, which is his great book. Nothing here is worth a tick. I hid everything except the heads. They respect slaughter. They respect only slaughter. They forget the other things we brought them, the ghazals, the gardens, the ice and symmetry. It's an affliction to grow up motherless, with your lady mother living beside you. They have many images, but they have no God. They're fit only for war. Even the dogs are second rate. In Tashkent, I had no money, no country or hope for one, only humiliation. But among the people, I found much beauty. No pairs are better. There are no accidents, there's only God. Tending to his doves on the eve of battle, my father flew into a ravine at the fortress of Aksi. He became a falcon. I became emperor. Sometimes, when I eat a Kabul melon, I remember my father and you. I've forgotten more than I've seen, but I have not forgotten enough. There's only one way to live in a place like this, with your disgust close at hand. One night, I took Majun because the moon was shining. The next day, I took some more at sunrise. I enjoyed wonderful fields of flowers, flowers on all sides. I saw an apple sapling with 5 or 6 leaves placed regularly on each branch. No painter could have done this. I made a schedule. Sunday, Saturday, Wednesday, and Tuesday for wine. The other days for Majun. Your letter puzzled me. The people are caught between constant spiritual anguish and a faith that will give meaning to the question that consumes them, the dual substance of Krishna, the yearning of man to know God. Between the spirit and the flesh, a great unwinnable war. Dear friend, write clearly with plain words. Writing badly will make you ill. Once, in an orchard, I was sick with fever and vision. I was young, but I prepared myself. 100 years or a day, in the end, you will leave this place. Long ago, my grandfather's face looked into mine, I think with love. Now, when we speak of ghazals, of metrics and rhyme, or of our most famous massacres, we speak. When he conquered Lahore, he planted a banana tree. It thrived even in that climate. His memory is so good, it gives him a second life. Mine gives me only a partial one. It's no more than I need. Thank you. This is the 2000s. In the end, it took so little to do us in. The imaginative use of fuel, the fuzzy grammar of this or that group of logicians, gifts of money to the strongest among us. Who could resist those voices raised in unison? Travel broadens nothing, the great martyr said, except your tan. It was the official position, broadcast without commercial interruption every evening at 6. The time for lyricism had passed. Also, kissing, sculpture, coco van, and the tango. And other items of behavior too commonplace to mention. They had G-D on their side. We had fear. Same difference, you might have said. I kept a wet finger to the wind. Depending on who was winning, I shaved or I didn't. This is a history of religion, the brief one. Annie chops her notebook into unequal pieces. I sneak a look at the words that appear on her page. I'm alone here. You are alone and distant as a star, without a name. Alone myself, lost in a hieroglyph, I measure the rain that blurs our house. The infinite, the enormous rain, unstoppable in its broken run to the sea. But I keep my ears peeled, and my eyes, Annie, for red flash or squeal of rubber, for any sign of time's arrival in our border town, or a man, a pious body robber, whose eyes sink like the sun in your sweet, dangerous, open face. If I watch for the tide to rise and break, we'll be fine if I stay awake. And this is the last of the lot. Very short one called Cut to Bits by the Sickle Moon. Who has done this? Schoolboys drained of all emotion but the one that will outlast them. Kneeling on the sands in waves through the 2000s, learning the fundamentals of blood sacrifice as the correct response to figurative art. Read the Goa poem that Akhil mentioned in his introduction. The midnight's cataracts whiten, and here's the sea hissing its one stuttered consonant. Leaf printed, you track the moon to a beached, bearded hull, a room of vertigo or freedom that narrows like memory. Small flames ascend a tree of light. The 32 palaces of Bodhisattvam tremble on the vellum smooth water like flotsam. If tonight the mind is queasy, drawing thoughts like flies, he is fine too with every crazy scheme you devise, none crazier than this pilgrimage to appear that seems to have disappeared. Leaving you, seaborne at last, ahead of you the past and all its famous cities lost. Marriage season in Delhi. I think it might be always marriage season in Delhi. I'm going to read two marriage poems, one for and one against. I'll let you guess which one is which. This is Fool and Flea. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here to join together this fool and this flea in holy matrimony. Fool will sing, flea will suck. Fool will work, flea will pluck. Both will learn the virtue of obedience. Fool will give up his freedom, flea will give up whatever chance she may have had at happiness. Both will die. Fool first, flea so full she'll burst. Yeah. And this is untitled. When it rains, the dead descend. You appear, the smell of rainwater in your hair. Wearing the ring I placed on your finger, a scent like heat and a voice not yours, a child's voice singing of age-old danger in Hindi, a lover's lament from Pyasa. Your lips, clear of the color you wear, are not new to me, are lovely and bare, and our old argument still burns. How soon will you forget me if I die? By the river in this room and the way it returns, I swear if I forget you, let everything die. When it rains, the dead ascend, disappear where we cannot follow into the living air. A few new poems. This is addressed to Auden, and it quotes two lines from Auden, well, one line really. In the opening, it's a bit rude, but I think Auden was a poet who understood rudeness. Anyone who drank martinis for breakfast, wouldn't mind, I think. But you never know. This is called What Would You Know? Or What Would You Know? Or What Would You Know? About suffering, they were never wrong, the old masters. Oh, shut up, why don't you, you old bastard? I've had it up to here with your opportunistic philosophizing. You who have never suffered but for your art, who wouldn't know a liver from a heart, shut up, I can hear you. If you weren't so white and creased and vegetable, I'd give you a hearing, but here you go, no. Now fuck off, old master poet, old fart. This is The Future Infinitives, and it was in a book of photographs by the Delhi photographer Gauri Gill, a book of photographs called The Americans, to do with South Asians in America. It's one sentence. All over those bland, continuous states, in ghettos amalgamated beyond Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, to one easy race name, South Asian, one umbrella brand, Indian American, in basement sublets, dorms, mortgaged cookie-cut homes, where god lights blare like truck horns, coatless or bundled, hard hat, headscarf, askew in cold sun, a mother and daughter slaughter ready at the register, or that man rushed, clenched shut at Dunkin' Donuts, at Upna Bazaar cash and carry on Roosevelt, a food-fragrant driver of a yellow taxi, those sisters, shy and not shy, rival sports trophies and photos arrayed, the dead one's husband, emperor-sized bed against uncurtained white wife light, empty house and he alone with remote, and the priests of the convention cathedrals, limp wrists extended over wine cocktails, suits and flesh glossy in the gloaming, wild glint of fossil fuel, DC's far domes winking yellow, oh, all over those blonde, bland states, saying to Gauri's camera, it's me, barefoot in the ballroom of the dream, poised, posed, alone, almost American. Thank you. This is Rules for Citizens, 10, and one of them kind of riffs off one of yours. One, let us govern those, it's a response to Plato and his rules for the ideal state. Most important rule in that, of course, is that no poets are allowed. Very sensible, if you ask me. Rules for citizens. Number one, let us govern those who undertake the telling of stories. Number two, censorship is good governance. Self-censorship is an attribute of the highest civilization. Three, if an actor speaks of God, he will be chastised. He will be refused an encore. If he repeats the speech, he will have his license revoked. 4. Let us govern those who undertake praise of the next world, since what they say is neither true nor useful to us. 5. Our best recourse is to be warlike. 6. We do not deny that storytellers are good at their job and give people what they like to hear, but the better they are, the less we wish our children and men to hear them. 7. We shall refute their attempts to be wise. We shall scoff when they repeat their vile allegation, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must remain silent. We will do away with the dirges of famous men and leave them for women, and not the best among women either. 9. Let us abolish those fearful and terrific names. Blank, not really. The river of lamentation. Styx, the river of fear. Ganga, the river of death in life. Lethe, the river of bliss. Tigris, the river of affliction. 10. We shall disallow travel and the mingling of songs. Last poem. This is called Life Sentence, and it's one sentence. Let's say you're not opposed to the ghost in principle. You understand her neediness. And let's say she's distracted or busy. She's busy looking for a way back in, but the shore appears distant, not to mention impossible to attain. A far-off place where her former friends no longer speak her name, which is lost. And no word she hears is audible through the static and the clatter. So let's say you forget to speak her name. You do not repeat her lovely name because your talk is of meat and money. And let's say you're not crazy or bitter. It's just that you don't want to hear her say, why? Why did you not look after me? Thank you very much.
There are a few things on my mind, but if anyone else would like to start? Okay. One of the things that Srikanth that I was thinking about while you were reading, and it intercepts even the way you tell the story, is that you are a creative writer, but you also teach creative writing. And I'm thinking, how does the teaching of it come back to your craft? Clearly, it comes back, to interrupt your narrative, but how does it also flow with it? Like both in terms of when you're writing and what you end up writing. Like, so if you could tell us something about this relationship, which you've clearly maintained for so long now.
Well, there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. And, one thing that occurred to me when I started writing this thing was that, a lot of writers teach, but they never talk about it. It's kind of the dirty little secret of, people who are, teaching creative writing programs. So I didn't want to kind of deny the existence of that part of my life and, writing this. But also, I think teaching creative writing is, I feel awkward saying this while I'm being recorded. It's a kind of, you're teaching a subject where there's not actually as much content as there is if you're teaching other subjects. And so I really feel perplexed a lot of the time when I'm teaching my subject. And so, I think that kind of uncertainty and perplexity is actually kind of a good thing for writing, and why not bring it into the writing.
You take on that avatar at the University of Goa. So, like, how does it pan out for you?
It's a new thing for me. I haven't done it until the last couple of years. I have to say that I now understand why writers I know who also teach are often so conflicted about it, because even if your class is about 3 hours in a day, I find myself good for nothing else. Once that's done, 'cause before the class you're preparing, after you're just really drained, and I find I'm not very good for written work, especially while I'm teaching. So, I think I don't think you would do it if you didn't have to. Yeah.
Strange, because in India, actually, the discipline of MFA creative writing is only now getting introduced. So now you're starting programs at different universities, but public sector universities remained away from creative writing. That's something you learned anyway. Like that's something you learned outside discipline.
That was the wonderful thing about the American project, really, because right from the 50s, American poets were paid by universities, and I think that was the first time, possibly in the history of poetry, because it happened before it happened in the UK, that poets were given money, by anybody.
That's a big mistake,
Enormous mistake, a tragedy, really.
No, yeah.
But, I mean, for instance, Elizabeth Bishop, when she ran out of all her father's money, which was only in the last 2 years of her life, she got a Harvard lecture, and which paid for the next year. So the last 2 years were lived on money given to the poets.
And because of her friend Robert Lowell.
Yeah. So the other question which I had for Srikanth, so your second collection was the Voyager, which is space. From the space to the underworld, like what led you to the underworld? What does it do for you as a simile, right? Not like the underworld, but the underworld.
Yeah.
How does it work as a metaphor for you? What does it allow you to do that something else wouldn't have?
I think simile is probably part of it. The more that you kind of, the more that kind of environmental degradation and all kinds of things appear in the news, the more one starts to think that ancient cultures, ways of imagining an underworld, are a lot like the world that we're beginning to inhabit. But I haven't really figured it out yet. And there's also a geeky kind of fascination with, in a kind of Dungeons and Dragons-y kind of way, with descents into the underworld, and also the kind of dream of returning from the underworld that poetry and literature have always kind of imagined. To me, I think it's kind of interesting to imagine maybe not returning and just kind of making yourself at home down there. So.
I've heard Jeet read his poetry thrice, and every time, I mean, one of those readings was actually done to someone playing a piano. But every time I hear Jeet and the sound of his poetry, I'm always imagining someone lightly strumming a guitar, someone playing a piano, someone being with a violin, and I'm thinking. So, for instance, the New Year Night in Goa, or the later poem where you work with a sound where the music is implicit in it, and as a songwriter, as a musician. Like, what has your relationship been between your poetry and music? Like, how have you managed it? How have you thought about it? And how is it changing for you? If you could tell us something about that.
Sure. There are some poems that don't lend themselves to music, really, and are meant to be read. And I usually don't read those out. Meant to be read on a page. I try not to read those out because I think it'd be asking a lot from an audience. Although this audience might be up to it, So I do try and pick poems that where you can hear the music fairly clearly, and often that has to do with rhyme, really. And I've picked up a lot really from listening to the jazz singers and how they use rhyme, and how even somebody like doing a version of Cole Porter uses rhyme. There's a kind of that's where the beat poets got it from. It's to do, I think, with trusting the rhyme, and letting the rhyme carry you, and letting the rhythm carry you.
There's just one more thing which was striking me, and we'll open the session soon for everyone to ask. The first poem that you read mentions the Badshah. The second poem was about Babur and takes on from there. And I'm just thinking, what does it mean for us to write about, to think about, to play with and sing about an Islamic dynasty which ruled this country for the longest amount of time, in a time when the Hindu right wing is on the ascendant? The Prime Minister of this country is also a poet. He's published this collection called The Journey, which has horrible poems like Our Intellect is Garba, etc. So, and the previous NDA, which is when 2004, when your other collection came out, that right on the heels of a previous Prime Minister of the NDA regime, who was also a poet. And I'm thinking, what does it mean for us to go back to Babur when we have an Narendra Modi?
Good question, because really the point is Babur was a real poet. A good one, and an amazing, actually, critic of poetry. Some of the bits of Baburnama that jump out at you are the devastating one-para disses of other poets. And the book is full of them, and a devastating criticism, really. And every once in a while, he'll also quote one of his own poems, very approvingly.
That's great.
Yeah.
But both of you ended up, as far as subject matter goes, coming back several times to what I interpreted as various anger, regret, frustration about American wars in the Middle East of the past 10, 15 years. I heard the list of dead Arab names as being a list of dead Iraqis, although I guess they could be Syrians or something. And there are echoes of watching September 11th and war after it in the first set of poems you were reading. I don't know if it's just a coincidence that we have both of you watching media, places that are far away, and feeling, horrified or disgusted, filling up your mental lives and mixing that with these other experiences that come up in the poems. I don't know if I'd be curious to hear whether that's something you see very often in poetry of the past 10, 20 years, especially, or if it makes you wish you read fewer newspapers, watched less TV, or if you think this is just inevitably the way that mental lives are going to be made up going forward.
Go first. Well, I mean, I think the media thing is really like a big part of that. Why those war images, kind of shape a lot of what one ends up writing. But I think for me, and obviously a lot of people are thinking about this really carefully, one thing we learn from every war is how terribly images fail to make the reality of what's happening to people felt, right? And so I think that's one thing that, I think if you're working in any medium, in language or in sculpture or anything, you want to make the actual force of the damage that is happening felt in a way that images are failing to make happen. And maybe it's a way of kind of just exercise, like, in a psychological level, it's a way of kind of just trying to get it, flush that out of your system. But also I think maybe to, find other resources for, conveying that, your experience of others' experience.
Yeah, well, also it's impossible really to get away from the image.
Yeah.
And specifically news images. I was in New York during 9/11 and going to work the morning it happened. And within, I think, 2 hours, the image, even in New York, that you kept seeing was, the plane going into the tower. And it was shown all day, although it happened 20 blocks down from where I was, we were still watching it on television, Similarly, when, in fact, the anniversary for 26/11 was yesterday. When that happened in Bombay, we all watched it on TV because the news coverage was, and in India it's often insane the way news is gathered at a site of a tragedy or a catastrophe. Often the news becomes part of the catastrophe. And I remember watching that in Bangalore. So it's very difficult to separate really the images that you've seen from even if you happen to be there at the time, from your memory of it. And I think when you're writing about it, that really is your job, to try and remember as accurately as possible what it was like without being infected by the god of television.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Weinberger. Thank you for reading for us. Jeet opened with a poem that addressed sort of the religious diversity of India, and that came through very strongly. And Chico, of course, in your poetry, you talked about the thanatology across a couple of different cultures. But then in response to the kickoff question for the Q&A, you were a little dismissive of the notion of the underworld, and you mentioned the geekiness of it. So I wonder, when you think about literature, whether there's still power in ideas around hell and death as presented in sort of the classical forms, or whether it's moved past that and it's much more ironic, even in a world, or perhaps because of a world that's perhaps consumed by media with ideas of death.
I was unduly dismissive of both the discipline of creative writing as an academic subject and of the kind of issue of like what happens afterward. But in a lot of ways, I think it would behoove us to like think about the way that other cultures imagine an underworld. They're very different from the Christian ones, and some of them are kind of funny and eerily smart. Like the Chinese underworld is this big bureaucracy that you kind of enter into and have to have your papers, and you get turned back, and the Mayan underworld is a whole other kettle of fish, and just thinking about the ways that different peoples have imagined that world beyond this one, or within this one, I think can give us some resources for thinking about this world, right? And so, in a lot of ways, I am kind of, trying to write something that has lots of facts and information and things that people can think about. But, I don't know that that literature is going to stop global warming. I think it's, so that's a hard. Yeah.
When you're teaching to different audiences,
Yeah.
fresh-faced high school kids,
Yeah.
do they respond differently to these ideas? Is it obvious to you as an instructor that some of your students take some of these things more seriously than others?
Yeah. I think some of them do. Not the ones in fatigues don't necessarily take them more seriously. The ones in headscarves or the ones wearing a orgy of one T-shirt, and so, I think, one thing that's been interesting in thinking about teaching and thinking about this is you really just never know where the kind of unbelievably interesting insight's going to come from. And a lot of the things that happen, in what I read actually did happen, so. Teaching is a little bit like a trip through the underworld. Yeah.
Well, I don't think there's going to be another collection of poems. I just don't think I can equal that one. So why bother trying?
I'm slightly more inclined to think that if I continue writing, it will be more on the lines of writing about the non-classical images, so to speak, like things which are a little more like personal and individual. So and that's obviously a product of the fact that I see a lot of people actually responding to images of the classical themes, which are obviously a product of the media and all of that. And even in the realm of the alternative, there's social media and different a lot of other channels where a lot of these non-classical themes, which are still a part of collective experience, are getting some kind of responses from poets. So as it happens, the poetry I'm writing right now is purely like personal and individualistic. The problem I face in the context of that is that sometimes the images I'm using are so local and so culture specific that I struggle to find the balance between giving my images the true representation that they deserve. Sometimes bringing in references to my own language or to little acronym. India is full of acronyms, so like little acronyms like PCOs and IITs and God knows what that are so Indian that it might not be very accessible to a global audience, which I do not want to obviously lose. So what really is the balance between that kind of local specificity and also making a global audience relate to you?
Think about that too much because it could cripple you. Some of the great novels I can think of were now that we have Google, of course, it makes it much easier, but there was a time when you would have needed to research to find out what those references were referring to. I just think it makes it richer and it adds a layer to it. And I really think the point is something else. That isn't the point of it. And if you let that become the overriding thing in your head while you're writing, I think it could be very difficult to write.
Yes, I'd also like to thank all three of these wonderful speakers, Srikanth and Jeet and Akhil. I'm thankful for a lot of things, some of which I probably shouldn't admit. For example, I did have a slight sense of panic at being unable to fill in some of the blanks in Srikanth's river quiz, which is troubling because I actually do teach in the epic sequence in Readings in World Literature. So I'm very, very grateful to Jeet for filling in some of those blanks for me, including the Sanskrit one. And more seriously, I'm grateful to all three of them for filling in many kinds of blanks and for letting us see some blanks and fillings that we might not even have noticed before. One of the challenges or mandates of the University of Chicago Center is to serve all the parts of the university, including the humanities, and so it's wonderful to have an event like this, but where the humanities are concerned, one of the sometimes heartrending aspects of being here in India is to see how often expressions of human experience tend to be ignored. And as a Sanskritist, it bothers me especially to see how little attention seems to be given sometimes to expressions from other times and other places. So it's wonderful to see this evening, among other things, these vivid examples of the enduring presence of these expressions, and to be revisited so freshly and movingly by Babur's muskmelon and the queens of Mesopotamia and the Indian river of ash, Plato's bureaucracy. So I've enjoyed this evening very much, and it's a very good thing for me as an American on the other side of the world to be able to celebrate Thanksgiving Day by having so much to be thankful for. So thanks to you all.